I've just been listening to a discussion between JF and a vegan on the topic of whether killing and eating animals is ethically or morally consistent with believing in or having a preference for a robust system of human rights. Now, this is in name what the discussion was supposed to be about, but so far I've listened to about 2 hours, and most of it is about whether consistency in ethics is significant, and both of these men are moral nihilists. Neither believe that there is anything in the objective world, in the real world, corresponding to our subjective moral phenomena. Now, I used to hold this position as well. And the reason I did was that I couldn't understand what the mechanism for an objective morality might be. For instance, with our intellect, everything that we perceive, sure, all of our intellectual phenomena are subjective, but we believe that they are approximations of actual objective structures which adhere to the principle of sufficient reason. And that is the mechanism, that there is a logical consequence in logic, that there are true mathematical relationships in math, that there are true relationships between objects inherent in a material world. And we recognize these true relationships, these true systems with our intellect. Imperfectly, yes, but there is some there that the intellect approximates. Now, when it comes to our moral sense, what would that be? Outside of our feelings of something being right or not being right, what is it in the world that equates to the sense of the good or the evil? In the last couple years, I've come to the conclusion that I was simply being obtuse. I refused to acknowledge the validity of suffering. There is an ontologically basic nature to what human beings and other creatures presumably find preferable. Creatures flee from suffering, and creatures pursue the course of life that leads to the greatest flourishing, that leads to fruit. You know the tree by its fruit. And the animals that are fruitful are the animals that live up to the ideal of that type. And there's an intuitive sense in which we can recognize that the alpha wolf actually looks healthier and looks better as a wolf. And even we, as human observers, can look at two wolves, one the beta or the gamma and one the alpha, and we can say which is the better wolf, which lives up to the ideal of the wolf. Now, that's a Platonic argument, and you don't necessarily have to buy it, but there is the fact of suffering and there is the fact of prosperity, right? These are existential conditions, as ontologically basic or more so than a belief in a mechanistic material nature to the noumenon, right? All that we believe to be objective that the intellect grasps in the empirical world is actually a matter of conjecture. We don't know for sure that it's out there. But moral phenomena, suffering and pleasure, and this sense of rightness that we have in our actions when we follow our conscience, that is ontologically basic and undeniable. The error comes, and you can tell with the language that they're using in this discussion, when you call these preferences arbitrary. Now, it's easy to view morality as epiphenomenal and not substantive if you believe that it is at the discretion of the individual. JF understands that these preferences are evolved, that they are part of his nature as who he is, as JF, but at the same time he perpetually uses this term of an arbitrary preference. Now, it's possible that some of our preferences are arbitrary, in that if we focus on liking something, we can actually kind of come around to it. Like, if you didn't know before that carrots were good for you, and then you found out that they were good for you, you might tell yourself, whenever you're eating them, I should be doing this is healthy for my body, and then eventually you might actually like carrots, and that would be an arbitrary preference, because we arbitrated it. But there's no arbitration having to do with the majority of our moral preferences. They're just there. And some of them are a result of our evolutionary conditioning. So that's the basis of morality. We all have it because we evolved this sense. And up until this point, This is identical with the nature of our intellects. We evolved our intellectual faculties in order to ascertain facts of the world in which we live. The facts were such that the evolution of the intellect was advantageous. Now, why would we not continue that line of thought when it comes to our moral sense? The fact of nature is that there are circumstances which will lead to flourishing, and there are circumstances that will lead to destruction. Hell is real, heaven is real, in other words. Now, assuming that there is a reality to destruction and growth, to health and sickness, it's no leap at all to say that our moral subjectivity is approximating a real state of affairs, a real law, a real moral law, in the same way that our intellect approximates a real physical law. Moral dynamics are inherent in the structure of reality and not just in your brain. If it wasn't inherent in the structure of reality, why did your brain come up with it? Why was it useful? Why was it adaptive? There is a reality to flourishing and health and good things, and there's a reality to destruction and death and bad things. And it is obtuse to say that avoiding suffering is a mere subjective preference. We don't avoid suffering because we just happen not to like it. We avoid suffering because there's something ontologically basic about the badness of suffering. Suffering, the feeling of suffering, equates to a destruction of the coherence of the organism that we are, right? Whenever you're suffering, that is indicative of some kind of falling away from the ideal state of health. And we define the ideal state of health as that which engenders the creation of the most fruit. You judge the tree by its fruits. So a fruitful individual is doing something right. They're moral. They are adhering to that objective law. You reap what you sow. Does anyone really believe that there aren't inherent moral consequences in the world? They're there in the world. They're not just in your head. Your conscience attempts to model what sorts of behaviors will lead me to that garden in which I want to find myself, but it does so imperfectly, which is why there's disagreement over moral matters. That's just at the individual level. Some might levy the criticism that this is a form of hedonism or utilitarianism, that I'm simply saying that the most pleasure is the best. And that's not entirely fair, in that I'm not talking about pleasure exclusively. I'm talking about what leads to prosperity and health and productivity for the individual. And that's what traditional systems of morality typically value. That is, except for the ones that value asceticism. But then you have to look at what is the broader social impact of ascetic behavior. And I'll make a digression that I've made before in other videos, but I will make here. The shaman has a role to play in the development of consciousness. Why is the shaman able to come up with these new behaviors? He doesn't act like the rest of the tribe. What does he do different? Well, usually he experiences trauma at an early age and is ostracized or experiences some form of ostracization. He goes into the wilderness and often encounters a near-death experience. That's the archetype of the shaman. What that isolation does is to draw him into a kind of sensory deprivation. So you imagine in Siberia, the shaman or would-be shaman, one-day shaman, sitting in his igloo, motionless, just trying to live, just trying to survive without his tribe to rely on, and his mind goes through a change through this process. He's not distracted by constantly seeking out things that will increase his chances of mating. That's what most people do. Most of our lives, most of the time, is obsession with activity that will lead to greater odds of reproduction. Now, there's also hyperstimulants like video games that get in the way of that, but the reason that we're attracted to those behaviors is that it's modeling the kind of behavior, saving the princess, that ends up in reproduction in the natural condition. But anyway, the shaman avoids that and is in sensory deprivation, and his mind levels. This is the difference between a child's consciousness and the consciousness of the adolescent. The adolescent is capable of focus and a directed, conscious engagement with particular problems in an agential way, not just being confronted with obstacles and responding to them in an animalistic sense, and being extremely discursive. A child is extremely discursive in its conscious orientation. It flits from one experience to another. But the shaman doesn't do that. The eventual adult doesn't do that. So that is the evolutionary advantage of ascetic behavior. It's good for not necessarily the shaman, although sometimes the shaman as well. You imagine a cult leader who has mastered some form of asceticism, like Mohammed, who goes on to be the progenitor of a great nation or something like this. Even aside from that, being that shaman, being that ascetic, you bring conscious focus and attention and capacity for new types of thought, some of which may end up having productive implications. You bring all that to the community when you engage in asceticism, which is why we value having a priest around, having somebody who's not always trying to get laid. We want someone dedicated to a worship of truth, the structure of things, which the shaman is able to see. In the ancient condition, this was reaching into the subconscious. In the modern day, this might be the scientist or perhaps philosopher. And actually, many of the great philosophers of the Western tradition have been lifelong bachelors. They did not pursue sex. They pursued focus on a higher problem, right? So that's why asceticism is good, because that has spillover effects for the rest of the community. Which leads me to what I was trying to get to. In the beginning part of this monologue, I was talking about the reality of moral phenomena as they confront the individual, not an arbitrary preference, not something that's merely subjective, something that objectively presents itself, situations and implications of situations that objectively present themselves and their consequences present themselves to the individual. You move from there to the reality of group morals, group mores, and their adaptivity or maladaptivity. So just as in the case of the individual, we have a conscience which, for better or worse, in a real sense, directs us to certain kinds of activities. Human societies have moral systems that we can actually sense in an intuitive way. It's not just reading what the sages of the society have said. It's not just listening to others. It's also intuiting what other people would think about this. We internalize the alterity of the moral judgments of our peers. And collectively, there is generated a kind of communal ethos. And some moral systems in some societies are better objectively for the survival of those communities. So everything that we talk about when we talk about morality equates to actual good consequences and actual bad consequences. The reality of pain and the reality of suffering is not something to sweep under the rug and say that it's mere preference. It's not mere preference. So those are some of my thoughts on moral nihilism and its pedantry. If somehow JF sees this and would like to debate on moral nihilism, I'd be more than happy to do so. Thank you for listening.